very excited today. We haven't had any Grinnell College students present yet, so this is very exciting this fall. So very excited today to have Dr. Karla Erickson, Reese Komsthoeft, and Maya Llewellyn, both class of 2025. So it's coming, guys. It's a reality. It's this May. Excited for you guys to be here. But they will be presenting, as you can see behind me, Tethers and Tight Spaces. I should have asked you that. Harvesting Pandemic Stories. So we're excited to hear about that. Will you please help me welcome this group to present on this topic?
So I'm Karla Erickson. I always love doing Becca courses. Thanks for being here again. Nice to see you all again. One of my favorite audiences that I get to interact with. And as soon as I was talking to Sarah about it, I said, well, but can Reese and Maya come? So I'm super excited for you to hear what they talked about too. So my job today is just to kind of tee up how this fits in the larger arc of like my research and course design, and tell you a little bit, get you ready for the stories from the pandemic that Reese and Maya are going to share with you. Okay, so this is the three of us, and our goal over the summer was to get familiar with existing studies and with people who were attempting to capture memories from the pandemic as a shared lived experience. And then we worked together in what's called a pedagogy partnership. Thanks to the Mellon Foundation, we have this grant called Humanities in Action, which is meant to take humanities and make it like more active. And I thought that that would be a great grant body to ask for help for remembering the pandemic, because I very much believe that a shared trauma like that, you can't just like return to normal and kind of bury those memories. You have to have some social science tools and some therapeutic tools to reach repair. And so I had gotten in on that grant to help with what I've been doing, which is I developed a script called Harvesting the Pandemic that I'll share with this group in case you want to do it in your groups. But it was an interview format that I had borrowed from one of my meditation apps. And it really helped me with some of my underlying like regret and longing after the pandemic. And so it helped me, and I used it to structure like some journaling I did, and then I did it with my family, my partner and my son, and then I did it with my mom and her partner, and it just kind of worked for all of us. And so I then turned it into a one-on-one experience and started inviting people with whom I had some underlying trust. They had been my student, they had been my advisee, and I brought them in and said, I don't want to know about politics. I don't want to know about what your state policies were. I don't want to know about, your kind of politics of lockdown. I want to know what it was like to be you in the pandemic. So imagine if in 10 years from now, a little person comes to you and says, Maya, what was it like for you to live through a global pandemic? Where they're really wanting to know, like, what was the essence of that experience? What did it change about you? What did you lose? What did you gain? And so that's kind of what our collective work is emerging from, is a sense that social scientists are particularly well located to capture some of those social meanings of this epic shared experience that many of us, for a lot of reasons, want to, tuck it, put it in a box, hide it under a bed, right? But what I found when I brought people into my office, there was a little bit of tentativeness initially, but some people, my question format was only a 3-question format. And some people would talk for 90 minutes just based off of the first question, like I never got to the second question, because it turns out we have a lot of stuff stored up in there, you know what I mean? Like once you kind of break the seal and like, oh, that makes me think about this. And so the three of us, when we got together in our pedagogy partnership, did this Harvesting the Pandemic activity with each other, and each other's memories sparked new memories in each of us. And so what Maya and Reese are going to do as senior social majors is they've cherry-picked some illustrative examples from their own experience, kind of by way to invite you also to think about the pandemic. So I have been giving some just its meanings, right? Not the virus, not the science of it, not any of that, but just like you and your kind of daily quotidian practices, like what changed, what stayed the same. And so I'm still kind of early into the research. I've had some family health issues that have kind of slowed down my research trajectory. But I am convinced of two conceptual tools, and Maya and Reese will introduce additional conceptual tools, but they're in the title, Tethers and Tight Spaces. And so I take Tethers from Dr. Keisho Scott's work. How many of you know Dr. Keisho Scott? She's given a lot of bucket courses. So in her first book, about Black women surviving the academy, she talks about the very narrow spaces that Black women had, particularly in the 1980s in higher ed. They had very little navigational space, right? Like, it's like you're here, but we're not going to give you a lot of space to navigate. And that's kind of what the pandemic felt like for me and my family, was like, you do have some choices, but they're highly mediated, right, by the conditions of the virus and the public health recommendations. And so that's what the tight spaces is about. And then the tethers is about kind of, when I think of tether, but Reese is going to bring up another analogy, I think about the string on a kite. The string on a kite, it anchors us to something, but not in a debilitating kind of way, right? It gives us kind of an arena that we can float about in. And so a lot of us found things, some of which we had done prior to the pandemic, but some of which we invented, and you'll see some of the things that these two invented, to tether us, to give us a sense of purpose, to give us a sense of routine under the restrained conditions of the pandemic. And so one thing that we find is that although people's tethers and tight spaces are quite different, right? Like, some of my students were in 600 square foot apartments in Brooklyn, New York, and some of them were in massive mini mansions on golf courses, right? Those are very different navigational spaces to be inhabiting, but we all had a little bit of space and a little bit of navigational power. So that's was kind of the impetus of our work together. And as soon as I got into pandemic work and I saw what was happening when people were just kind of really like spilling their guts, which is not what always happens when you're an ethnographer. I'm an ethnographer, and some people, people usually craft these pretty careful stories when you interview them, but instead you could tell how raw this was and how often people would be like, oh, I've never told anyone that, in that kind of way. I became really convinced that this was an activity that we could do together, and that it would be a very good idea to have a course about the pandemic for at least a decade, and that social science would be a good place to put that. It wouldn't always have to be taught by me. It could be taught by a historian. I see Dr. Laxon's here. It could be taught by a psychologist. It could be taught by a gender and women's studies scholar. But I wanted these smart seniors who have been in classes with me and are really adept educators themselves to help me think about, well, how would we even organize that? What would be the thematics? Because for me, the pandemic remains a collective raw experience in which we have not yet decided how to think about it, right? Like, we have set ways of thinking about 9/11. We had set responses to 9/11, right? The pandemic still remains this kind of raw, in some communities untouchable, in some communities an open wound, in other communities like, let's just get past it, it was bad, right? And so for social scientists, we're really interested in that kind of rich data about what connects us, what challenges us, what does this teach us even about community? And so it was really fun to get together this summer, really fun to have the kind of money that we usually put toward writing a book towards writing a class, right? So for Maya and Reese to get paid to find out what was the literature that was out there already, what were people trying to do, how could we use that, and then how could we think about, well, what are the thematics, like how would a course be arranged? So all of that is going to come out in what Maya and Reese have done. They haven't done the interviews themselves because we had paused that to think about the class, but they've read the interviews, so they're aware kind of the research end of this as well. So the first thing, this is my only job, and then I'm handing things over to Reese, is to kind of talk about some of the materials that we found, and we'll be happy to put you in touch with these titles if any of you become interested. We were excited to find that some writers at the very cusp of the pandemic were smart enough to form collectives and to collect stories of the pandemic as it was happening and to anthologize them. So here are two anthologies by writers that we read and that were quite beautiful. Several photographers also took kind of the bull by the horns early into the pandemic and decided to capture the visual lexicon of the pandemic. So this is a book called The Year That Changed Our World. It's a little hard to see the picture on the right, but if I explain it to you, I think you'll know what you're seeing. So we're up at the top of a church, a cathedral, looking down, and that is the priest. And these are all pictures of people because they can't physically be in the church because of lockdown. So you see how the pews are full of photos rather than humans. So this was an international photography project in which they captured the first 90 days of the pandemic visually. So we would turn through these also to spur our own imaginations and to remember things about our own experience. So these are pretty luscious photos of essential workers who are continuing to labor in Bangladesh and Indonesia during the pandemic. we were also interested, of course, in what are the chapter titles, what are the books called, like what were the first titles that emerged about the pandemic, what were the ones that emerged in 2023, thinking about that. This was one of our favorites, and we'll probably use this one in the class. Coming of Age in 2020 was a project by the New York Times where they had young people who were approximately of high school age send in their projects. So the projects up on the left here are done by people between 15 and 18 years old. Really beautiful book. So one thing that we noticed is like stories tend to, if you ask for enough stories, there starts to accrue like a story arc. And so what we're finding about the pandemic is when you sit people from a variety of backgrounds down and ask them what was that like for you, there are certain kind of markers along the way that you too might share. So we thought we would just point these out because they'll probably come up kind of naturally in what Reese and Maya talk about. So almost as if prompted, when I said, what was that like for you, people would always back up to the day before the day, which a lot of us have called the last normal day. And so it's kind of this way of someone who knows you but is being interviewed now saying, this is who I used to be, right, before the pandemic came. So that's really interesting in terms of what do they highlight about the day before the day. And then they say the day it started and the kind of slow reckoning that went on, right? For our students, we have pictures of when we call it Apocalyptic Friday, when they got the notice that they were leaving campus, and we have all these pictures of them huddled around their phones. Well, it was actually Wednesday, but we had to leave Friday. Where they're collectively looked at their email and realized, oh, I'm leaving campus and I don't know if I'm coming back. But for all of us, we had that moment where we're first like, oh, there's a disease of an unknown entity, but then there's that moment where you realize this disease is going to dramatically alter my life, right, this virus. Then there's the day that now we're kind of shut down. We've been here in 30 days, 90 days. On our campus, Dr. Renard Kington, who had been the head of the National Institute for Health, who was the president of Grinnell College at the time, so he's an international expert on health, early on was telling us 2 years, and we just wanted to put him in a box. We just wanted to be like, Renard, you go in the corner. That is not right. But he was right because his expertise told him. And so, that slow eating feeling that you were having where it's like, well, they're still saying 90 days, but realistically, if this is in every nation on earth, is it really just going to be 90? That kind of slow creeping realization. Then later into the pandemic and the lockdown, the day they thought it was ending, that little glimpse of light, and you kind of let yourself have a little bit of hope, and you kind of think, ooh, the thing I'll do first, right, when it's safe to do so. And then that sinking day where you're like, oh, it's not actually over, because there were a lot of false kind of reopenings for a lot of us. And then people talk with real tenderness about the day that they thought they couldn't go on. And you can imagine that sometimes that day that they think they can't go on has to do with having lost someone or losing a job, something really noteworthy. But for some of us, it was just the end of resilience. You know what I mean? It was just like every day until then, you're like, I can do this. I used to go up into my closet and give myself little positive mental talks. Karla, just 2.5 hours. I know you hate virtual teaching, but just, it's 125 minutes, right? But people just at different stages of the pandemic lost their will and thought, I can't see a way of maintaining, myself and my, generosity towards others. So that came out a lot, and it came out, as you can imagine, as a kind of confession, but also thinking that they were the only one that had that breaking day. But I think a lot of people had breaking days. And then the starting to re-enter the stream of life, and then a little bit of sadness and nostalgia. That re-entering the stream of life wasn't quite as easy as you've imagined it for so long, and then there were some obstacles, right, to getting back to things, to getting back to life. So I think you'll hear those kind of stages of the pandemic in what Reese and Maya are going to talk about for today. So our plan for today is to just share some of what we learned, and like I said before, to encourage you to remember your experience. So the one thing I wanted to say is I've given some talks without these two. It'll be way better because they're here. But people do kind of float off in their minds. So don't feel guilty at all if Reese or Maya is talking and you kind of float off into your own pandemic experience. We're inviting you to do that. And then to also experience kind of that pleasant connection of not doing this alone in a corner, right? Of trying to remember, and we think of it as kind of reconstitute the pandemic when you have good company around you in terms of having these two women in front of the room, and in terms of the bucket course, which is a place where a lot of us have learned a lot of things together. So with that said, I'll hand things over to you, Reese.
Hi, everyone. My name is Reese Komsthoeft. I'm a senior at Grinnell and a sociology major, and I'm excited to talk through my experience this summer. So to start off, I kind of wanted to talk about how I did my own reflection. So this summer for me was a lot about collecting. It was collecting stories, collecting ideas, words, thinkers, books, and that collection kind of led me to this thought process of using the pandemic as a model to explore and understand blank. And in that blank, you can put a lot of different ideas. You can put some themes, you can put your own experiences in there. But for me, the big theme that came out of all the conversations that I had, all the readings that I did, was well-being. So throughout the pandemic, everything, obviously we all know, shut down. We're kind of left with nothing. We're left with none of the social institutions that we usually frequented. Connection was taken away. And in that, all of us were kind of forced to think about our own well-being for ourselves. And in this idea of well-being, the way that everyone kind of defines it is the state of being comfortable, healthy, and happy. So during this global pandemic, when everything stopped, how did you find how to be comfortable, healthy, and happy? And that's a really hard question to answer. But throughout the summer, and in my own reflection, I know in mine, Karla's reflection as well, we found bits of humanity in the pandemic. And that's kind of what I want to talk about with using the pandemic as a model to explore and understand our own humanity. So there are 3 dimensions of well-being that I want to talk about today. There's routine and rupture, anchors, and pace. And all of them are different themes and ideas, but they all go together really well. So to start off, routine and rupture. Here's some reflection questions that I want everyone to think about. What was your routine pre-pandemic? So I'll kind of take you through my COVID experience a little bit to help you think and generate your own ideas. Pre-pandemic, I was a junior in high school. I was 17 years old, and I would wake up every morning, 7 a.m., go to school from 8 to 3. I would go to basketball practice right after school. I would come home for about 30 minutes, eat dinner in that time, talk to my family maybe, and then I'd go to soccer practice. After that, I would do homework and then go to bed and do everything over and over again. And for me, my well-being came from the in-between moments during that time. So it was in between classes in high school, talking to my friends, that in between soccer and basketball practice where I talk with my family. There were a lot of other kind of rituals and things that I did during that time, but in my reflection of the pandemic, those were the things that stuck out to me, this rigid schedule. And then after kind of reflecting on that and my high school experience, I thought a lot about when the pandemic first hit, how did those routines that I had shift? So when COVID hit and we all went into lockdown, the routines that we all had just ended. And I didn't have to wake up at 7 a.m. anymore to go to school. I didn't have to go to soccer and basketball practice anymore. And even though I loved those things, it was kind of a moment where I had to pause and think about what did I want to do with my time? What could I do with my time? And a lot of my time ended up being spent with my family. And that is a very privileged position to be in, having a family that I'm so close with. But my sister, my older sister, she was in college at the time, and she was forced to come home because of the pandemic. So while there's this global catastrophe going on, I got my sister back. And I had a younger brother who was, in 7th grade at the time, and me and him were not very close before this. But when you're stuck in a house with your siblings, you kind of have to hang out with them. So my routine ended up hanging out with my siblings. I would wake up every morning, and class at the time just became 1 assignment a day for each of my classes in high school, which that is not at all what it was before the pandemic. I would have to go from 8 to 3, and then after the pandemic, my work got done by noon, usually. And so with that, I had an entire afternoon and evening to do whatever I wanted. And it's a really interesting experience to reflect on that. But the things that I found during my new routines is that all of it was rooted in well-being. And all of it was rooted in how can I make myself comfortable, healthy, and happy right now? And that was similar for a lot of the people that I talked to, and amongst a lot of demographics and different people and different experiences in COVID, a lot of it came back to how do we get through this? How do we be comfortable and healthy and happy? And so back to routine. After the pandemic, a lot of what I was thinking about this summer is what got thrown away and what stayed during my routines from the pandemic and now being back at Grinnell. And for me, a lot of what stayed was the connections that I made, the deep connections that I built with my family, the connections I made with my friends during that time. And before the pandemic, I loved to read, but I'd never had time. During the pandemic, I reread the entire Harry Potter series in about 1 week. So that was a really funny experience, but I read every night before I go to bed now. And so there are things that happened during the pandemic that I want to pull from to talk about what humans do in times of need. How do we find our well-being? And so some of those anchors, which is what I'm about to talk about in a minute, stayed with me after the pandemic and became part of my routine. So when these, big societal structures got ruptured, what did we keep and what got thrown away? And so that's one of the reflection questions that I want everyone in the room to kind of think about and sit with. But on the next slide, I'm going to show a video of something that my parents did during the pandemic. Every morning, they'd wake me and my siblings up with a morning announcements to try to resemble some of the routine that we had. So you'll see my dad. Hopefully this will work. I'm not sure if it's going to. But it's basically my dad saying, "Good morning, students. Today is a blue day," which is what my high school called, the day-to-day. And then he'd give us kind of our schedule throughout the day, and then at the end he'd give us a quote to try to alleviate some of the sadness of not being able to go back to school and not being able to go to practice.
Good morning, student. Today is Tuesday, October 6, 2020. Today is a blue day. There will be soccer practice at 3:30 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. Lunch will be served at 11:40 a.m. When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see, I won't be afraid just as long as you stand by me.
Sorry for the unfortunate cropping in that video, but so that kind of leads me to the next part of it before I get into that. During our Harvesting the Stories, I went back just this past weekend and looked through some of the quotes that I had from my own reflection. And so me and my younger brother would go on these things we called world tours, where I live in the suburbs of Chicago, and we would get on our bikes and we'd go up and down all the blocks. And it would take about 2 hours. But during those times, I connected with my brother. We had a shared Spotify playlist that we listened to. So in my reflection, I wrote that I would look up while riding my bike down our hill and see light peeking through the trees and really feel like I could breathe. And so that goes to show that during this time of, global catastrophe, and it's a really, really hard moment where I couldn't see my grandparents, I couldn't see my friends, I'd have to sit 6 feet apart from them. There are things that we can pull from it that show us who we are as humans. And so this next topic is similar to what Karla was talking about with the tethers, the things that keep us afloat. And for me, this summer I read All About Love by Bell Hooks, which is probably the core reading that I did this summer to remind me of the pandemic. But anchors is this idea of the things that keep us from falling into a sea of despair. So in a lot of the conversations and a lot of the readings that we did, there are anchors that keep popping up for a lot of people, and the main one that, for me, as if you couldn't already tell, is my family and my friends. And that was true for almost every single person that I talked to about the pandemic. The anchors are the people that are in our lives and the loved ones that we sort of fostered. So here's some pictures from my COVID experience. In this top picture, it's a picture of me and my older sister playing handball, which my dad played professionally in college, and it was kind of one of our family things that we had always wanted to do but didn't have the time. So he took us out to the courts and taught us how to play handball, and I'm not very good at it, but it was very fun to do that with my family. And then in this bottom one, you can see a picture of me and my mom, who is pretty much my rock and my anchor throughout the COVID experience, throughout post-pandemic experience. And then in the picture next to that, it is me and my brother and dad going on a walk to my best friend's house, and we said that we needed to stay 1 Reese apart during social distancing. So as I said before, there was I had a lot more time to do things that I previously wasn't able to do. For soccer, I play on the women's soccer team at Grinnell, and I don't think I would have been able to do that if it wasn't for the pandemic, because that time allowed me to hone some of the skills that I previously couldn't do. I would go to practice and we wouldn't work on my left foot. But the pandemic offered me time to, work on soccer. And then reading, which, as I said, the Harry Potter series was very grounding for me during the pandemic. But yeah, so these are some of the things that I'm reminded by during my reflections. And I think what you'll find in doing your own reflections is that there are anchors that come up, and there are these, deep-seated things that are core to you as a human and core to humanity. And so social connectedness is kind of this big one that came out from talking to people about the pandemic. And finally, the last thing about well-being that I want to talk about is the pace. So this was kind of core for each of us in our conversations about the pandemic, but we kind of, after doing a lot of readings, whether they were like social science papers or whether it was All About Love by Bell Hooks, we kind of determined that for those of us who had the privilege of exploring life during the pandemic, there was a whisper of a comfortable, slow life filled with new rituals rooted in curiosity and care. So during this time when there's a lot of hardship, there's this global trauma going on, there are times where we found ways to connect with our humanity. And so again, I want to kind of come back to this idea of the pre-pandemic, during pandemic, and post-pandemic, and kind of what the pace of life was during each of those times. So for the pre-pandemic, I was exhausted, tired all the time just because I was going to school every day, 2 practices a day, and not really lending any time to that well-being. During the pandemic, there was a lot of things that were really hard that impacted my well-being negatively, but the pace of life was not one of them. This slowed pace, which again is a very privileged position to be in. I was not an essential worker. I was a 17-year-old girl in high school. But during that time, that slow pace allowed me to think about what I wanted and what I could do with my life and with my future. And then finally, post-pandemic, I think the pandemic was a really unique experience that we all lived through to kind of understand our humanity and understand what we as humans need. And during that time, that slowed pace of life, we got kind of that whisper of what life could be if we slowed down for a minute. But that didn't really happen. Coming back to Grinnell, going back to high school and then coming to Grinnell, we've talked a lot about this idea of grind culture, which is this culture and this ideology that promotes working and striving for success, often at the expense of well-being. So this is a term that kind of constantly popped up for us, and we talked a lot about. But grind culture is kind of felt in each of us. It's felt in our bodies, and it's a very American kind of culture to be a part of. And talking about that and talking about how this wasn't really a thing during the pandemic at all. And so what can we take from the pandemic that we want to implement in our day-to-day lives? And that, to me, is that slow pace of life that I had during that time. And that's kind of a collective, experience that we found throughout our work. And so here's another quote from Tricia Hersey from Rest is Resistance, which is another one of the core readings from the summer. But she talks a lot about grind culture and how it is not normal for us to be exhausted and constantly working. Our well-being should be the priority, not necessarily this success. And so the quote reads, "I wish you a deep knowing that exhaustion is not a normal way of living. You are enough. You can rest. You must resist anything that doesn't center your divinity as a human being. You are worthy of care." And this connects to the another quote that I pulled from my own reflection, which is, "I had always been close with my family, but the pandemic gave me the opportunity to slow down and worry about my well-being." And so in these reflections, and this was probably day 1 of our summer work, and so before I had any knowledge about what this experience was going to bring me, I had the anchors, I had routine, and I had pace, all kind of built in around this idea of well-being. And so then finally, I want to return to using the pandemic as a model. So for me, the kind of final thing that I want to talk about is using the pandemic as a model to explore and understand better worlds. So the pandemic, a heartbreaking experience, what can we pull from it to do better in our world? This is a very, very unique experience. But for me, there's a lot from the experience that we can pull from to think about how to better our lives individually, but also better our lives societally. So as a sociology major, I think a lot about kind of what are the social structures that are in place that are impeding well-being. And grind culture is a really, really big part of that, and the pandemic offered us a glimpse into what life would be like without that. And so when you strip away some of the like hardness of reflecting on these really hard times, you can find glimpses of what the pandemic can offer us to make things better. Thank you.
Focus back in on the presentation. Maya, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi there. Hello there. Can you guys hear me in the back? Are we all good? Okay, great. I got this headset. I'll be hands-free. It'll be great. Hi. My name is Maya Llewellyn. I'm also a senior Soc major, and I'm really happy to be here. Yay, bucket courses. Thank you all for taking this time on this Wednesday to come hear us talk about COVID. Woohoo. Awesome. So this project and this work that we were able to do this summer was really such a gift. Karla gave us space to follow these paths of curiosity that we had already been having, thoughts that I had been having since COVID, and like all this like identity formation stuff. Coming to age in COVID, I didn't realize how much it had shaped me, and I really appreciate the space to think about that and theorize and read and reflect and rest. That was really huge. I have an excerpt of Karla's instructions for us from our very first meeting this summer. I'll read it aloud for you all. It says, "Your directions, definitely for June, but really for the whole summer, are these. Play with your rhythms, your spaces, your habits. You have time now to read the things that are compelling you, whispering to you, to fall down a rabbit hole in a search or a referential string." I love this part. "Lay in a sunbeam and do nothing for as long as you can. Then see what short writing or memo comes out of you. Try voice memos, long walks, change up your spaces. Everything you learn will come in handy for your senior year, and really, forever." And that is really true, I think. Can you learn and make knowledge outside of self-judgment? Can you listen deeply to your body and find out what you need? Can you follow where your curiosity takes you? Yeah, I know, wow, right? So, as I said before, this project for me has been a big undertaking in remembering like the initial lockdown and also interpreting the reverberations COVID has had throughout the trajectory of my life here at Grinnell and in general. And I'm coming away with 3 themes, similar to restructure. That was awesome. I'm coming away with like a renewed commitment to practicing self-compassion, a revaluing of caring for each other, and some tentative hope for the future, but hope nonetheless. Yeah. So my COVID experience, I was a senior in high school. It was my second semester. I was really looking forward to being a second semester senior and doing all the milestones, and boom, it hit, and none of those things happened. But my family had just put in an offer on a home in Indiana, and we were actually moving at the time that the pandemic initially started. So my family took the time when we had like online work and school to go out here to Beverly Shores, Indiana. I don't know if anyone's been there. It's a great place to go birding. But we were able to spend time in nature and have a lot of space to be and experience the outdoors, which was honestly, it was such a privilege, and it was also so lonely. I think I also, you can see the piano in like the upper right-hand corner. With all this time that I had on my hands, I was putting pressure on myself to like create as much music as I possibly could to make meaning out of COVID and to like produce something of value And it was a vicious cycle, and I was just like being really not self-compassionate to myself about my creativity, and just kind of like draining myself further. Even though I had all this time, I was really pressuring myself to use it right, and that I still feel regretful about that, but I think I'm learning to let go. So one of the books I chose to read for this summer was called Real Life by Sharon Salzberg. She's a meditation teacher and an author of over a dozen books on mindfulness and meditation. Really smart woman. She's amazing. And the book Real Life that I read was about moving from a state of constriction to a state of expansiveness. And in reading about constriction, I thought a lot about how I was experiencing the initial time of the pandemic. She defines it as the times we experience limited options, the blunting of our creativity, a feeling of disconnection, and the dimming of our vision of what is possible. So in like real terms, we were experiencing limited options in the spaces we could inhabit and the people we could see. But really, like, the constriction was internal, or I was just so emo all the time, and it was tough. This is like, and just like the loneliness that the time was. This is a long exposure photo I took in my living room of me kind of not really there, and I thought it was fitting. But in this time of constriction, like Reese, I was able to form new routines with my family and spend time with them, when in reality, like before, our rhythms had been so fast that we'd only really seen each other during dinner times and in the morning briefly. But we would go on long walks together, watch Tiger King and stuff like that. And me and my younger brother got a lot closer at the time, which was honestly such a joy, because oh boy, we would fight a lot before that. And now we're thick as thieves, so it's really great. So yeah, the opposite of constriction is expansiveness, which Salzberg defines as the potential for openness, spaciousness, clarity, and freedom that exists within each of us. I thought this is a screenshot from a video I have of my brother. We were like biking along like the coast, and then he like put his feet up and he was just like throwing his hair back, and it was just like, I don't know, yeah, like the most beautiful moment, or the fact that we could find moments of freedom even within this time where like things were so constricted. And it's because we had each other that we were able to kind of tap into that expansiveness from time to time. So Salzberg states that connection is our greatest source of expansiveness. Like, we need each other to really get out of the tight spaces of COVID and the tight spaces of our mind and kind of enjoy life. I don't really know. She states, however alone or cut off we might feel, this world in truth is one of interdependence, of relatedness. This is a picture of online decision day that my friend edited. I'm the stick figure with the Grinnell College t-shirt on. So in this time, although we weren't able to see each other in person, we found new ways of laughing and coming together, and I love this picture so much. And COVID just really made me not take for granted community any longer, and this definition from All About Love by Bell Hooks really rung true for me, so I'll also read it aloud. Community is the coming together of a group of individuals who have learned how to communicate honestly with each other, whose relationships go deeper than their masks of composure, and who have developed some significant commitment to rejoice together, mourn together, and make each other's conditions our own. So as the pandemic went on, me and my friend group were able to find new ways to be together. We would sit outside, we like the birthday candle little torch thing, and just gathering outside. All my friends are wearing the same outfit. I thought that was funny. But honestly, like the COVID pandemic like solidified our connections as a group, and it brought us closer together, and I'm so lucky to have them in my life. This is another quote on expansiveness about quiet eyes, and I think it's enlightening. So look at the world with quiet eyes whenever you can, and let go of grasping. The world will come to fill you without your straining for it. In that relaxation, you will find peace. And a lot of what I was experiencing during COVID was this straining, or I was cattle prodding and like guilting myself into creating things and like maintain, or just kind of like getting ahead in life. It was like the remnants, or the roots of grind culture, which still are existing, but I think this summer really gave me a space to think about the choices I can make around like letting go and pace. And because I have these, like the ability to make choices like these, I can slow down, and I can enable you guys to slow down too if I'm slowing down. So I took a gap year because Grinnell was going online, and I ended up tutoring the second grader in online school. So I would basically tell her what time it was. I was like, it's time for math, Lucy. Like, let's go to Potbelly, let's get a sandwich. And we spent months together, 8 to 5, 5 days a week. And it was really like such a joy to be able to connect with somebody who's like at a different stage of life than I am, but also heartbreaking to see like the impacts that COVID had on her learning. I was glad that I was able to be there and like kind of help her, but I'm also not certified in teaching reading, so it was kind of like I don't know. But like we can work with each other, and it's always nice to be able to see her like a little bit when I go home for breaks. Maybe I'll do some babysitting. But when I think of COVID and I think of my gap year, I think of spending time with this second grader, and just like my community at this time was my parents and family and her family, and I was the only person my age, and it was really interesting to kind of just like be the only one of like this like coming of age space. It felt really lonely at first because like I had been used to high school of like everyone being my own age, but it was nice to be of use and to be able to help take care of her, especially since with her online and her parents working full time, like there was a lot that was falling through the cracks, so I was able to take up some of like the weight off of like her mom, who was like a lawyer working from home and who had like a lot of responsibilities to take care of. So it was nice to be able to fit into that family a little bit, yeah. And as Reese said, during COVID, we got whispers of a slower, comfortable, what-if world, and I think that's something I'm taking with me, is that not everyone had the chance to experience the slower pace, but those of us who did, like, we remember it, and it's in us still. So now that we've kind of arrived at the new normal, there's a lot of, like, angst and longing for, like, this kind of learning that we had. Like, was COVID a missed opportunity, or is it a building block for something new in the future? This is one of my favorite quotes by Indian author Arundhati Roy. She states, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And I think in order to change and get the world that we want, we have to start with rest. We have to start with resisting, and we have to start with Tricia Hersey's claim that rest must interrupt. There's a lot that can be done from a restful place. It's a generative space where we can have ideas about what we actually want to do. We can make choices with intention and kind of like practice this self-compassion and take back like our own control over ourselves and not give so much to like the system of grind that is a part. I think we can really learn from that. So this is an example from a book I read this summer that I really liked, and it's about slowing down. It's from Ruth Ozeki's Tale for the Time Being, and it's about old Jiko, who's this Buddhist nun and also the grandmother of the main character. And this is a description of how she approaches her time. Old Jiko is super careful with her time. She does everything really, really slowly, even when she's just sitting on the veranda, looking out at the dragonflies spinning lazily around the garden pond. She says that she does everything really, really slowly in order to spread time out so that she'll have more of it and live longer. And then she laughs, so you know she's telling you a joke. So this summer I got the time to slow down and reconnect with the things I think are like central to humanity, which is like gardening. So I got to plant these sunflowers and they grew outside my house, and it was really confidence building and just kind of like getting my hands in the soil and slowing down and spending time with my community members that were here. It was a really restful and rejuvenating time and set like a good foundation for our final year here. And just, I'm living with intention. It's amazing. And I'm left with a renewed value of community in my family. This is me, or not me, this is not me. This is my brother and my grandma before COVID. This is after she got vaccinated and we were able to be together again. And this is us this summer when we got matching hats. So I love my family. I value them so much, and I'm committed to living a meaningful life and caring for the people around me and slowing down when possible. You know, it's all about that. Yes. Okay, so this part is also about another fictional book. Has anybody here read Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler? Yes. Okay. Karla's read it. Yeah, me too. So basically, in this book, Octavia Butler is a dystopian fiction writer, and she writes about a world in which it's similar. It's a dystopian future, and the protagonist of the book has this religious belief system that she's like, my vision is to spread this thing, which she calls Earthseed, and she's like, my vision is to spread this and to launch humanity to the stars. So she has these, she wants to make a change, and this religion is part social movement and sort of secular in the way that it doesn't promise an afterlife. It promises memory only through children, work, and memories to the members of Earthseed. And it has a bunch of parables that guide people's stuff in it. But this is the first one in the book. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. And the only lasting truth is change. And God is change. So Butler's focus on action as like guiding social change really can come in handy now, because I think in this time of lots of things happening in our world with climate change and just like the rise of like dystopian elements of our world, I think there's a lot of despair out there. But this piece of fiction serves to remind us that when in doubt, like, it's best to act. Butler offers us a way through and shows that just by building something and not being discouraged when something goes wrong, that's how we can really make a change. I think the whole trajectory of the book is the main character trying to get Earthseed to catch on and to spread, and there are so many setbacks along the way, but it's because the main character keeps at it and works with community and works with like humane activities like gardening and like living in community and kind of like helping each other and supporting social safety nets like schools and other stuff like that. It's only once the dust has cleared or once the worst is over that the masses are able to look up and turn around and like take a look around and decide what they want to do with their energy. So I know it's kind of a little depressing because it's like we have to wait till the worst is done. But maybe we don't have to wait till the worst is done. Maybe we only have to wait until there's a moment of pause and a moment where people can look around and make intentional choices about how they want to impact the world around them. And I think we all have a responsibility to do the best that we can. I'm losing it. But I think this book has given me hope for the long term and a renewed commitment to doing what we can in the spaces where we can. And it's about the right moment. It's not like just because things aren't working now doesn't mean that we're screwed. I think I have a lot of hope. So in conclusion, it's important to talk about COVID, and we have the ability to open up space for each other to help kind of conceptualize and think about what that experience was for us and find connection. And we can slow down and open up that space for each other. And as Salzberg says, connection is our greatest source of expansiveness, and the good will spread when it's time. Thank you very much. Yeah.
It's working now, I think. Is it? Okay. Thank you so much to you both, and I hope you can see how, closer to the mouth. There we go. Okay. I hope you can see why just laying two really beautiful stories next to each other, you can start to see like these synergies, and you can start to see like the untold stories of the pandemic, right? And so I think when we thinking about the pandemic and what it meant for us locally, like Sarah and I were just talking about the derecho. How many of you were here during the derecho? You know, that was like really local, and I mean, maybe a lot of us had that day where we thought we couldn't get through because of the derecho. I mean, I remember just being like, "Are you serious?" I mean, I don't know if I was talking to God or the sky or whatever, you know, because. So, you know, so just suturing that stuff together because it gives you that feeling of having been through a journey together. We looked a lot at the children's art, at the high school students' art, and a lot of them were kind of huddled down as if they had wings, like surrounding them. And I think a lot of adults felt that way too. And so I think we worry that when we scratch the surface, it's just going to be all sorrow all the way down. But that was the opposite of what we found. Like, we found all this cleverness and, like Maya was saying, like all this ingenuity, not like the grind of like, I must make music, you know, which is really grindy, but more just like, well, Reese's dad, for example. I mean, like, that's deep ingenuity, you know? And we just found such artful accommodations of one another. And so we've been kind of collecting those. So I wanted to talk a little bit about like how lucky I feel, because I'm somebody that in a very old-fashioned way, I have a sense of craft. Like, I come from teachers, I am a teacher. So teaching is kind of our shared occupation, like the way it would have been in pre-industrial times. That like if you were a shoemaker, if your parents were shoemakers, you became a shoemaker. And so early into the pandemic, my mom and her retired friends who used to teach elementary school would sit in her driveway at 6 feet apart and problem solve how they were going to get all these children to learn. I mean, they, you know, because they picked the problem that was their problem that they knew from their occupational life, and they're like, how are we going to get these kids back safely so they can learn? Because they knew from being elementary school teachers how central the sociability of other children and other grown-ups was. And so that was kind of the work that they did. And I initially had this like super like immature to the point of toddler attitude about online teaching. And unfortunately, I was on leadership at the time. So I was the one throwing a tantrum in the room constantly when we were saying, we're just going to have to take everything online. And I'm like, none of us have any idea how to do that. And it is going to be horrible, you know? So I was like the one, like the naysayer in the corner. And the turning point for me with that was actually watching our local teachers and how quickly they pivoted. I mean, they were just so artful. And so the day that I'm sitting with just like some really needed humility in my own driveway as they drive by to say goodbye to their graduating kids, I was like, if they can do this with the resources that they have, right? Like Grinnell College can pull this off, because it was amazing. Like Principal Conway, who's my neighbor, said that they just huddled. If they would just get there and they'd be like, who's here, who isn't sick? And then they would just huddle and they would take different roles. You know, sometimes somebody who was usually a second grade teacher was making food that day, and they just got themselves and their kids through it. And like, was it exhausting? Yeah, but it was also testament to their craft, right? Like, they were at the very top of their game as teachers. And so we've heard some of those really, I think that's one of the dangers of kind of keeping these stories of the pandemic trapped down in some kind of cavern inside of us, because there's a lot of beauty and art, and you saw it in Maya and Reese's stories, things well worth digging up, you know, and kind of showing to each other. And as many of you know, I studied death and dying and the end of life, and that's very much the same, right? When you start to talk to people about their dying experiences, there's all this beauty and joy and humor, right, at the end of life, but we're all so tentative to talk about that, that we often kind of keep those stories really private. So by kind of taking our tender stories out and comparing them to each other, we were able to really reinforce that. But one of the things that I just wanted to say to this group is one of the really unfortunate stories that has developed, because it is both true and not entirely true, is that kids didn't learn during the pandemic, right? And of course, there's all this learning loss specific to spelling, reading. One of my favorite stories is like, because my son is the child and grandchild and great-grandchild of teachers, you better believe that he has to behave well in classes. So when he was at home taking classes, one day he was spinning in his chair. And I was like, Eric Cargelati, you face front and you listen to your teacher. She's in her first year and she's having to deal with this crap right now with the pandemic. You sit there and you listen to her. And he goes, Mother, look at the screen. And on the screen there was a foot there was a stuffed animal. So he was like actually paying the most attention of anyone in the room. And one girl kept raising her hand and asking when lunch was. And this super patient 22-year-old was like, I don't know. I'm not at your house, right? Like, so I was like, how are you going to learn under those conditions? But what I really wanted to highlight about what Maya and Reese said, and you really see it when they talk out together, is they learned an incredible number of things that generations before them did not learn. Did they get the same consistency of Spanish language lessons? No. Did the new math get like hammered into them the way that it used to? But this generation of young adults has wisdom that comes through, finding yourself and finding, techniques of survival and self-cultivation. And it was really compelling for me as a teacher to get to work at a place for about 18 years before a pandemic, and now about 4 years after a pandemic. Because when we first got back was when I was the most afraid. We had been waiting like with bated breath and like goose pimples, so excited to be back in person. And then it was just devastatingly bad, Like the first 3 weeks of being back in class, I had students sobbing in my room. I forgot how to read. I'm so embarrassed, And it was just like we were just a wreck. I mean, we could not remember how to get back in the saddle or ride the bicycle or whatever narrative you want to use. And then on top of that, I was dealing with senior social majors who are usually some of your most generous, kind of world-building people, and they didn't respect or like the first years, and they were convinced that the first-year students were evil, and I had to sit them down and go, people, you're sociologists. There's no way that all the first years are evil. This has to do with the pandemic, right? Like there's some kind of distrust, like they are representing grief for you, or they are representing what Grinnell used to be that it'll never be again. But like, you're like there's just no way that 416 people happen to be evil. Like that's just not. And so, that was when I was really scared for us because I thought, are we ever gonna get back? And then there was another wave of grief when we got back. And we just picked back up all the stuff that we had set down, all the beautiful pace stuff, all the, I had friends that sent me these beautiful long stories that said, if I had seen you in the hallway today, this is the story I would have told you. How beautiful, right? And we didn't do any of that. We just like rushed back into it, and everybody was exhausted, like Reese was describing herself prior to the pandemic. And so then that was another round of loss, was that nobody would have chosen this horrendous pause and all the lives lost, but then to waste that pause by just going right back into it, like we were running back into a burning building, was like super disappointing. And I think a lot of organizations are still kind of, whether we're talking about a faith community or a family or an institution like Grinnell or this library, whatever the organization that we're talking about, we're still a little caught in that, I guess we're just kind of back, huh? Kind of moment where we didn't necessarily harvest the pandemic, right? We didn't necessarily take what was there on offer. But the big thing that I just wanted to correct today was how unfortunate to now have this story about this generation of people who have done more work before they turn 22 than most generations, other than like the World War II generation, do, before they're 40. They've had to learn things that you often don't have to learn until you're in your 20s or your 30s, or you have children of your own. And so it is true that they had some learning losses, but they also have cultivated some principles, some bedrock habits that I think we could all learn from. And it comes at a really good time because, as Maya was pointing out, the earth is kind of burning down. So, so I do think that this is a generation, just by virtue of when they were born, that they are young people that we should listen to. And I think that the story that they didn't learn anything and that their life just paused is utterly not true under social science standards. Their lives continued, except that they had to be much more active participants in their lives because they were not programmed by this kind of, what we have done to childhood and the way that we have overprogrammed childhood. I know many people in the room are very worried about that for your own children and your grandchildren. Is the responsibility of older generations. And these students had that experiment, right? They didn't pick the experiment, but they had the experiment where they got to lay that down and find out who they were without that. And I think that we should listen to them. I think that there's a lot there to be cultivated. So thanks so much for coming out, and we'd be happy to answer questions or hear your own stories about the pandemic. But it was really fun to get to share how we spent our summer with you. So I'll invite Maya and Reese back up too, and if you have questions or stories that come to mind for you, please. Questions, comments?
Maybe. There it goes. I'm going to make just a quick comment. Thank you for the quotes, and I'll say I was taking pictures because it's a reminder of how quickly I've forgotten how important it is to pause and all those things you guys were talking about. So thank you for those. That's a good reminder because I think we were talking about how things just spun right back in, and it continues to get busier and busier, and that's not necessarily always a wonderful way to live. So thank you.
I wonder, as your students were participating in this course design, did they have a chance to reflect on any of the stories that might have come from older interviews? Because being retired and rural, life didn't change that much, with the exception of social distancing and masks and travel, things like that. But life in rural Grinnell was not all that different.
Okay, so thanks, Al. So I know where Al and Nancy live. so you know, yeah, like that was a pretty safe place to be during a pandemic, right? Because I lodged my dog right up next to your house. But yeah, we quickly fell upon that. And in fact, I mean, it was a humbling moment for me because one of the people in the world that I most admire is George Moose. And he is a board member of the college, and he was an ambassador of the United States government. He's just a very wise man. And he told me, we were searching for a president at the time. We picked this person named Ann Harris. You might have heard of her. And George told me this hilarious story that he was in this like quite elegant elder community that has a lot of ambassadors and a lot of former government officials. And many of them are lawyers. And so they wrote up a contract about how to keep each other safe. And much like the Mayflower and St. Francis, they did an amazing job keeping people very healthy in their elder community, which not all elder communities were able to pull off. But you can imagine all these former ambassadors with their law degrees and, you know, the complexity of this contract, right, that they had all signed. And it was going quite well about 40 days in, and then one day somebody went to visit somebody else, because they're allowed to visit, right, because they're a closed group. And there was fresh, crusty bread on the countertop. Someone had snuck out to get their fresh, crunchy bread from the local market, which was not in the contract. And that caused like a cascade of like distrust. And I was like, wow, that's like an amazing story, George. Can I interview you? And he said what you said, Al. No. He's like, my life didn't change that much. And interview the kids, you know? He's like, you could interview me, but he's like, I think I was literally like the least impacted, right? Because I had so much control over what my life could be. And so, yeah, we were really thinking about that, about ruralness, and Maya had just had that experience of moving to a new place that was deeply rural and, as you said, lonely. But it made us think about, I think the three of us, this was before our summer together, but Maya did this fascinating project that some of you might have been involved with for a class that we had together, because we became newly interested in kinds of competency. And so what I would say is, like, being a rural person, like, you figure out how to get through a lot of changes that don't affect city people and don't make headlines and all of that, so that the rural experience was a very determinative fact. In fact, it may be why fewer people proportionately died in Iowa than in other places, because we're not as densely populated, right? We may never, you know, elevate that story. And so we became really interested in the kinds of competencies that entered into the pandemic. And so Maya started to get curious, I guess, about people your age. So I'll hand things over.
Yeah. I have one participant in my project here, Arlene. Hello. Good to see you. So last fall, I started working at the college pool as a lifeguard, and I would sit in the chair up there, and I was obsessed with everyone who was just like chatting and doing laps in the shallow end, and just like the social life that retired people had like created in this space. It was really inspiring to me, because I was like, wait, how do they seem so at ease talking to each other? There's no cliques, or everyone's just friendly to each other and also blunt, and like they're so I don't know, like the social skills were really strong. And I think like it was a curiosity that came out of COVID, because I was like, I feel so anxious all the time. I don't like making eye contact with people when I pass them on the sidewalk. How do I learn how to be better at that? And this project really helped with that. I think it was awesome. And just like, it is a skill to build up. And I think one of the questions I had was, is this a generational thing? Is it a later in life thing? Do social rules get less strict? Do people become more comfortable in themselves? And I think, yeah, it was a competency I was really interested in, and I feel like I have a lot to learn from people that are older than me. So, yeah, thanks, Arlene.
Yeah, and one of the things that we acquired, I think, from sharing our stories with each other was a sense of pride. Like, I think we had kind of a deficit story about the pandemic. I think when you don't harvest the pandemic fully, you remember those breaking points. You know, I remember myself, like, sobbing and saying, honey, I don't think I can do this, or a day where I felt like I disappointed my kid, or he didn't get the attention he needed. But when we more skillfully mined it, it became, I think, a source of pride. I know, Reese, you felt a lot of pride about how your family did it. I don't know if you want to say more about competencies that you started to notice when we did that.
Yeah, I think before doing this like harvesting activity, I kind of was under the impression that I like didn't have a soccer season my junior year, and my basketball season got canceled, and I couldn't go to prom, and those were kind of those moments where I was like just thinking about like, oh, the pandemic was the worst. And then after kind of this summer and after doing a little bit like more thinking about it, I got to spend time with my family that I would never have gotten to if it weren't for that. And so it's kind of like mining these moments of like goodness out of something that was really hard. And also like to your question, the experience from like older people that I got was from my grandparents. And I remember a specific story of on my sister's birthday. It was her 21st birthday. And, you know, typically a 21-year-old wants to go out to the bar and go to Chicago. But we couldn't do any of that. And so my grandparents drove down and they made her a sign and sang her happy birthday from like the street. And so while that's not necessarily the same experience because we were in a suburb, not necessarily in a rural area, it kind of made me think about their experience a little bit more and how not being able to see them as much as I could before the pandemic was one of the heartbreaking parts of that. And so it kind of made me think more about the experience of an older generation in COVID.
As you've been talking about this in regard to the pandemic, you have sent my mind back to my early years, which were affected by Pearl Harbor in 1941. How did that affect me and our society at that time? Because I was a 10-year-old. My father disappeared for 5 years from my life. And I'm going through the same process. You've pushed me through the same process that I lived through 80 years ago, because I'm in my 90s. And what was normal then? How did you deal with what was going on in your life then, with not knowing if your father would ever return home? And how do you reconnect with all of that when he does return home? So we have these kinds of experiences in our lives that disrupt everything. But how do we process it in order to move on and to become what we can become? And it's exciting to me to hear you two speak of something that happened early in your life that was a horrible disruption. One of our grandsons graduated from Grinnell College when? during the first year of the pandemic. No graduation. He started his first year of med school totally broken up. He's now in residency. But I think it would do us good, and you've helped me do it in a different way. It does all of us good to reflect back upon all of our lives and not to focus on single events too much, though at this point, this is the biggest single event in your lives. But be open to all of those big events that are going to happen, and you've had a chance to learn now how to deal with some of those when they come along. So thank you for the memories.
Thank you for that. That was really beautiful.
Okay.
A couple of things. First of all, three things. First of all, the charge that you had up on the screen that Karla had written was beautiful and makes me, Karla, you are an incredible educator, and Grinnell and your students are so lucky to have you. And I tried to audit your classes, but they're always full. Thank you very much. And another thing is, I was just pondering here just for a second. I mean, my grandparents lived through the First World War. My parents lived through the Depression and the Second World War. I have uncles who lived through Korea, although that seems to have not had the same effect as the other biggies. But myself, I'm born after the Second World War. Up until the pandemic, I had never come anywhere near having to have my life as disrupted as my previous generations. And it was a real eye-opener. And I'll just stop right there. The third thing is I would love to have a bibliography of the books and articles that you read. And if you could make that available, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I thought it would be great if we could extend this class to have another class of the people that are here share theirs.
They are still here in the spring, and so am I. But we will definitely get I think that's a really good idea to share out the script in case you want to use the script with yourself or your loved ones, and then also our recommendations for what's out.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm going to email you guys and think about the spring, but definitely give me the everything that you referenced today, and be happy to send that out to the group. Can we give them one more round of applause, please? You did so great. Thank you. And especially you guys, that's not easy to do, and you just look like pros. So awesome. I was not in your shoes as a senior in college, and I'm really, really impressed. So congratulations on amazing work, and look forward to seeing you, this next spring semester. We'll all be there at graduation cheering you on as well. So, which is really great.